Good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to Manchester. My name's Chris Orme. I'm the head of the School of Social Sciences here at the University of Manchester. I'm truly delighted to welcome this evening Professor Kate Pickett to deliver the School of Social Sciences' third annual Arthur Lewis Public Lecture. Kate trained in biological anthropology at Cambridge, nutritional sciences at Cornell, and epidemiology at Berkeley. She is currently Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences at my alma mater, University of York. She is also co-author with Richard Wilkinson of the much acclaimed and much discussed book, The Spirit Level. In choosing this book as one of the top 10 books of the decade, The New Statesman actually writes, it provides a vital part of the intellectual manifesto on which the battle for a better society can be fought. And that's the phrase I shall endeavour to weave into the next iteration of my school's strategic plan for the next 5 years. Kate is also co-founder and trustee of the Equality Trust, which works to improve the quality of life in the UK by reducing inequality. She was awarded the 2013 Silver Rose Award from Solidaire for championing that cause, and the 2014 Charles Cully Memorial Medal by the Irish Cancer Society. I note that a few years ago, she was invited by the King of Bhutan to take part in a United Nations project based around the concept of gross national happiness. I'd never thought that the concept of happiness was gross, but I'm not sure how much unqualified happiness we shall reap from tonight's topic, inequality, the enemy between us, but I hope it will give us plenty of food for thought. Kate, a very warm welcome to Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I was just saying before we started how amazed I am that anybody ever comes at all, and I'm impressed that people are willing to spend part of their evening here listening to ideas and asking questions. I think it's really great, so thank you all for coming. I want to start by putting up these quotes from a few world leaders. It's what they're saying about inequality. So at the top, we've got Barack Obama talking about income inequality as the defining challenge of our time, the Pope describing it as the root of social ills, and even Christine Lagarde, director of the International Monetary Fund, talking about how long the economics profession has ignored the impact of inequality, and the UN Secretary General talking about how inequalities tear the social fabric and create a host of problems. These quotes are all from 2013, and they represent a real sea change in public and political discourse about inequality. When we published our book, The Spirit Level, in 2009, inequality wasn't part of the everyday discourse in politics and public life. A Scottish Labour MP once told me that they were not allowed to talk about inequality in New Labour, strictly forbidden. So there has been a real change, and of course that's a good and important thing. Unfortunately, it's not yet leading to real policy change or real changes in inequality in the right direction in most of the world. But it's not just world leaders who have taken this up. It's also notable bodies in the third sector and charities. And Oxfam, who for so long focused entirely on poverty, now have a global 10-year campaign to reduce inequality. And they produced this statistic a few years ago, that the 85 richest people in the world own the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. It does make you rather want to put them all in that yacht and do something nefarious to it. But anyway, that statistic is out of date. It's now 83 people who own the same as the bottom 3.5 billion. And they take this figure to Davos every year, to the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum regularly places inequality now as among the top challenges that it believes the world faces. So as I was introduced, I am an epidemiologist. I'm not an economist. My interest in inequality isn't so much in the forces that create it, or indeed even really in the economic impact it has, but in the impact it has on people's well-being, broadly speaking, their health and their social well-being. And that means that I use statistics generally to compare societies with different levels of inequality and see how that relates to different outcomes. And as this is a public lecture, I know that not everybody likes statistics. So if you can understand this chart, that will be enough. This is the only one to sort of really take to heart and remember. When inequality increases, so do a whole range of problems. But really, Richard Wilkinson and I were really driven in our work by trying to understand why it is we have such a high prevalence, such a high level of distress, of misery, of unhappiness, of poor health, of low levels of trust in our societies. And I think if you'd asked any of our grandparents or other ancestors what they would think life was like when lived at our current levels of material well-being, they would have thought we'd all be happy with lots of leisure time and, enjoying living in such comfort and affluence, but we don't at all. This picture was taken outside Oxford Street tube station, but walking down from Oxford Road train station this evening, you could have taken the same photo here, I think. These are all probably employed young people off to work. Not one of them looks even remotely happy. Most of them look miserable. Some of them look angry. Some of them look as if they're about to burst into tears. They're not talking to one another. One's on their phone, but even that's not making her happy. So really, what our work is about is trying to understand why life is like this for so many at this time, and using epidemiological methods to try and unpick that. This chart is really at the heart of the spirit level. It was probably the most important chart in that book. And what it shows is how countries perform on an index of health and social problems that we created in relation to a measure of income inequality. And that index includes all of these things. So it's got things that are measures of health, population health in it. So it's got life expectancy, infant mortality, obesity, and mental illness, which includes drug and alcohol addiction. But it's also got things that are to do with social capital and the social fabric. So we've got homicide rate, imprisonment rate, and levels of trust. And then it's got things in it that are about human capital development, how well children do over the life course, what their life trajectories are like. So we've got teenage birth rates, maths and literacy scores for teenagers, and a measure of social mobility. And put those all together into one index, weighted equally, and here it is against a measure of income inequality. The particular measure here is the ratio between the incomes of the top fifth of the population and the bottom fifth. And in the more equal countries, Japan and the Scandinavian countries, that top fifth of the population have incomes that are about 3.5 to 4 times those of the bottom fifth, whereas up at the more unequal end, they're more like 7, 8, 9. So on this index of health and social problems, there's an extremely close and significant correlation between how well a country's doing, and if you're doing well, you're near the bottom, and how badly you're doing, that means you're near the top. So the USA, which is probably the richest of these countries here, highest per capita income, highest level of health and social problems, closely correlated with its level of inequality. Now, we knew when we started doing this work that it would be politically contentious. There are many people who are ideologically opposed to egalitarianism and greater equality for various reasons. And we knew they might think that we chose these countries, just to suit our argument, and also that those differences might be due to cultural reasons. So we did it all again with the American states. So this is the same index, except it doesn't have social mobility in it because we couldn't at that time get it for all states. It's not as close a correlation, but it is a statistically significant one. And at the more equal end, you've got states like Wisconsin, Utah, New Hampshire, and Iowa with low levels of health and social problems. At the top up there, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. California, Florida, New York, and Connecticut doing a little better than you might expect. So we see exactly the same relationship among those 50 states. And you can't explain that by thinking, oh, it must just be a difference between the Scandinavian countries and the English-speaking countries. We also knew that people might think we selected those problems that we look at to suit our argument. We actually selected them for two reasons. One is that they have social gradients. They're more common at the bottom of society, but it is a gradient. So even if you're just below the top, you're more likely to have those problems than if you're in the very top group. And we chose problems where we felt there was good, comparable international data. But just to check, we did it all again with somebody else's index of well-being, if you like, the UNICEF index of child well-being, which UNICEF produced in 2007. And some of you may remember this because it caused quite a stir in the UK because we came bottom, absolute bottom. Usually we have the satisfaction of being just above the United States, but this time we didn't have that. There are 40 indicators in that index of child well-being. Everything from whether or not kids can talk to their parents, eat their fruits and vegetables, get immunized, have books at home, how they do in school, etc., etc. And we pretty much did uniformly badly on everything. We are really good in this country at preventing traffic accidents and other accidents among the under fives. Crowded island, lots of cars, but we do pretty well on that. On everything else, really badly. So we came, bottom. Our kids are more likely to have sex before the age of 15, to be binge drinking, to not find their peers kind and helpful. We did particularly badly, really, on the subjective measures of how children are feeling. So anyway, a consistent picture across those two different indices, and whether or not we look at rich countries or whether we look at the 50 states. And since 2007, when UNICEF produced that first report, it's produced a further series of them. And that allowed us last year to actually look at whether change in income inequality over time in those rich countries was associated with changes in child well-being, which is a much more convincing piece of evidence than if you've just got a cross-sectional association with income inequality measured at the same time as the outcomes. We had the change in child well-being between the 2007 report and the 2013 report, and we looked at that in relation to changes in a measure of income inequality over time in the period 2000 to 2009. And those countries that had done slightly better on their measure of income inequality saw slight improvements in the index of child well-being, and those countries that had become much more unequal, or a little bit more unequal, saw their child well-being decline. And of particular note here, I think, are Sweden, fastest growing inequality in the OECD, and a real decline in its child well-being, and Portugal at the top, who, when we were doing our spirit level book, was one of the most unequal of rich countries, and now it's improved, and a number of other measures have improved alongside. I'm going to take you now through just a few of the components of that index of health and social problems, really because I want to show you the size of the difference between different countries. So I'm going to start with trust. And this is a measure, comes from the World Values Survey, from random samples of the population, adults, and they're simply asked whether they think other people can be trusted or not. And it's the percentage in each country who do. So in the more equal countries over here on the left, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, it's about 2/3 of the population that think other people can be trusted. And down at the bottom end in Portugal, they're fewer than 1 in 5. And we think this is a very important measure. I mean, it's always a measure included when people are thinking about social capital, people's ability to act collectively on behalf of themselves. But we think it also probably reflects what life is like to a great extent in social encounters, what social relationships are like in those different societies. So that if you're a woman walking home alone at night, or if you're a young man on the street and you see another group of young men on the next street corner, or what relationships are like on school playgrounds, at public transport, or at work. So we think it's a very critical one, and the differences are large and significant. And it's just the same in the United States, where their General Social Survey asks the same question, do you think other people can be trusted, of random samples in 46 of the US states, and that same correlation. And actually, in the more equal states, a similarly large proportion of people thinking others can be trusted, as in more equal rich countries. And then at the more unequal end, we're down to fewer than a third of the population who think others can be trusted. And I think we're starting to see some of the impact of these levels of distrust actually in the ways people participate in civic life, how polarized politics is. And there are some new studies linking income inequality to civic participation, including voting, and to how far apart political parties become polarized. So I think we're seeing this writ large all over the American presidential election at the moment. Here's mental illness. Now, a while back, people thought you couldn't compare levels of mental illness between different societies because different countries, different societies differ very much in people's access to mental health care, cultural attitudes to mental illness, how likely people are to be diagnosed, treated, seek help, etc. So the World Health Organization decided that it wanted to get a sense of the prevalence of mental illness in different countries. And so these data are from random samples, the adult population again, where they fill out what are called diagnostic interview schedules. So instead of you being asked if a doctor's ever told you you're depressed or you've ever been treated for depression, you're asked about symptoms of depression. And then those are added up together to come up with a total of people here, any mental illness in the past year. So down in the more equal countries, fewer than 1 in 10 adults having some kind of mental illness in the past year. In the UK, 23%, and in the USA, 26%, so more than 1 in 4. And we've just had recent statistics for the UK suggesting that this, still remains very high. It is increasing, and particularly for young women, and particularly levels of self-harm. So a very strong relationship here with mental illness. And I think this is probably the last of those individual factors. This is social mobility. Now, social mobility is something that you can get agreement on across the political spectrum. Everybody thinks it's a good idea. It's really motherhood and apple pie. Children should have equal opportunities. They should be allowed to have the same opportunities in life regardless of who their parents are. This measure of social mobility is actually, it's a correlation between the father's income when his son is born and the son's income 30 years later. So you need to allow enough time for children to sort of grow up and establish themselves as adults to be able to answer the question of whether or not rich parents have rich children and poor parents have poor children, or whether there's social mobility up and down the scale. So this is income mobility, really, but it's generally used by economists as a measure of social mobility. It's high in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Canada, Germany. It's low in the UK, and it's particularly low in the land of opportunity. So we often say when we're showing this, and then I saw Ed Miliband say it too, so I think he stole our joke, that if you want to live the American dream, you should go to Denmark. And actually, Americans don't laugh at that, generally. And I'm going there at the weekend, so it's always fun to do this talk in Scandinavia. It's like being in a warm bubble bath. They love you, they love it. It's a lot harder doing it in the United States. But that figure is so contrary to their national identity, their sense of themselves, what they believe their country is like. And it's hard to, I think, to recognize and cope with things that are very different to your expectations. So I think that's a tough one for them to be dealing with as a country, although it's certainly becoming better known. So I'm going to stop with what was in our book now and move on to what we've learned since. But really, to summarize, what we found was that inequality affects a very wide range of health and social problems. So you saw the 10 that were in that index. There are many more health and social problems also linked to inequality. The effects are large. So for something like teenage birth rates, there are 8-fold differences between the most equal and the most unequal countries. 12 to 16-fold differences for levels of imprisonment, 4-fold for mental illness. You know, these are big effects. And that's because inequality affects all of us. It's not just confined to the poor, the less educated, those of lower social class. It affects them the most, but the effects go all the way up society, so that if you're in the top third for education or the top 10% for income, you are still more likely to have health and social problems than your counterpart, exact same socioeconomic position in a more equal society. And that evidence has been growing since we wrote our book. So that helps to explain why the effects are so big. So wide range of problems, big effects, and inequality affecting all of us. We have colleagues at Harvard who describe inequality as a social pollutant because its effects are so widespread. But I want to spend the rest of the time on why it is that inequality causes these sorts of problems. What is it that makes us so sensitive to inequality? When we wrote the book, and when we were looking at the data we had, we were really relying for interpretation on the work from other disciplines, and notably psychology. And we were informed by experiments that psychologists had done to try and understand some of the kinds of problems that we were interested in. Are there any psychologists here? A few. I think you're the only one, maybe two. You do some quite nasty things to people as a profession, which is useful. But one of the things that psychologists have been interested in for a long time is what sorts of things are most stressful to us. You know, what causes us both acute and chronic stress. And over the years, they've done numerous, in fact, I think 172 studies were included in this review. Studies where mostly students were brought into a laboratory, given a pittance for their troubles, and made to do something stressful. And then their stress hormones were measured. And what these authors, Dickerson and Kemeny, who are psychologists in California, were interested in were what kind of tasks most reliably cause people stress, raise their stress hormones higher. And what they found was that it was tasks with what they call social evaluative threat that most reliably stressed people. So if I gave all of you right now a maths test, some of you wouldn't mind, some of you would hate it. It wouldn't particularly raise your stress levels, but if I made you all stand up one at a time and read out your score to everybody else, that would raise your stress levels. So writing about an unpleasant task isn't stressful, but if you have to perform something, be videotaped in public, that is really stressful. Okay? So if we measured all our stress hormones right now, you would all be fine, and I would not because of him over there, and you all here. It's situations where other people have a chance to judge you and judge you negatively. That's what we find most stressful. So that was one piece of evidence that we found useful. Another is that as well as affecting our physiology, our biology, what other people think of us affects our cognition as well, and how we think and our cognitive performance. And in this experiment from researchers at the World Bank, they brought Indian schoolboys into a classroom setting, and they were asked to solve puzzles, those maze puzzles when you find your way from the outside in towards the middle. And they had to see how many they could do in a certain amount of time. And they did it under two conditions. One, when they didn't know each other's caste, and the high caste boys here in lilac did equally well with the low caste boys in that more burgundy colour. But after they had gone around and had to announce to one another their caste, the performance of the low caste boys plummeted. And this is what psychologists call stereotype threat. So if you belong to a group about whom society holds particular stereotypes, you're conscious of it and you're aware of it, that can be invoked very easily and affect your cognitive performance. And we've seen the same thing in American studies with black and white high school and college students, where if they're given tests and just told it's a test, they do equally well. If they're told it's an intelligence test, that invokes the stereotype that many people hold about black Americans, and their performance declines. Ladies, I'm afraid we do the same with maths and spatial tests. If we are given them and told that men are better at that scientifically than we are, then our performance gets worse. And in fact, we're so sensitive to that, we only have to check a box at the top of the paper that says male or female for our performance to come down. So whether it's because you're poor, speak a different language, belong to a different religion, have a different coloured skin, are disabled, are female, whatever that identification is about which other people hold stereotypes, this stereotype threat can be invoked and affect our thinking. And also our emotions. Now, this one isn't with humans, okay? So this isn't psychologists, you're off the hook. This is biologists doing things with monkeys. And what they did was they took monkeys and they all lived all on their own, each in a separate cage for a while. And they scanned their brains, and this is a public, non-technical talk, so we'll say they're looking for happy chemicals, okay? Here are the monkeys individually housed who are going to go on to become dominant when they're put in groups. Here are the monkeys individually housed who are going to go on to become subordinate when they're put in groups. There's not much difference between them. So then they're all put into groups and they're given enough time to sort out their pecking order. Well, it's not really pecking order, that's chickens. Their hierarchy, so who's top monkey and who's bottom monkey. And it's really good to be top monkey, okay? You get more food, you get more sex, you get the best sleeping place, other people groom you, nobody fights with you. It's really, really awful to be bottom monkey because you don't get any of those things. So after they'd established their dominance hierarchies, brains are scanned again, and we see that the dominant monkeys are really happy by living in a group because everything good is happening to them, and it hasn't had any positive effect on the poor bottom monkeys. Now, you could do all of that with students if you had enough halls of residence, could move them around, but you couldn't do the next bit. It wouldn't be ethical because they taught them to self-administer cocaine. They learned. These monkeys didn't bother. They were happy. These monkeys took a lot, and then their brains looked like those monkeys. So I know they're monkeys and they're not humans, but they were definitely medicating against their social pain. And we have seen that income inequality is significantly related to illicit drug use, deaths from alcoholic liver disease, etc. Now, those were the kinds of pieces of evidence we had at the time. What we didn't have was any epidemiological evidence at all that the things that we were theorizing linked income inequality to health and social problems were actually worse in more unequal countries. So we were thinking that if stereotype threat is problematic, if social evaluative threat is important, if income differences are increasing the social distances between people, destroying trust, making income more salient, more important, then more people must be worried about their status in more unequal countries. But we didn't know, and now we do. So these data come from Late and Whelan in Ireland, and Richard Lake kindly gave me the data so I could redraw it here. And these are data from European countries. So the top line is for countries that have high levels of inequality, and the bottom line is for the low inequality countries, the more equal ones. And we're looking at levels of status anxiety by whether people are rich or poor. So we've got the poorer people over here at this end, and the richest people over here at this end. So whether or not you are rich or poor, more status anxiety in a more unequal society. And again, differences perhaps a bit bigger at the top, but certainly persisting all the way to the top 10% richest people. So this was really a confirmation of what we had been thinking about, and we really hadn't had that piece of evidence before. And I know from discussions beforehand that last year this lecture was given by Danny Dorling, who's now professor at Oxford University. And he and I were once working on a paper trying to understand why countries with poor levels of objective health have high levels of subjectively good health. So countries where life expectancy is low, lots of people say their health is fabulous. And we were thinking about how much more important it must be in a more unequal society to put on a good face, to show that you're doing all right. And he came across a quote from a Frenchman who said, "What sane adult would be happy, could be happy?" And so we do see national differences in how people think about things, but they certainly seem to be related to inequality. And what we started to think was that probably there are different ways you can respond to living in a more unequal society. So you've got a high level of mistrust, you've got a high level of status anxiety, more worries about how you're seen, more worries about what money means and showing that you've got it. What will that do to people? And what we thought was that people would probably respond in different ways. Some people would sort of go under, withdraw, become anxious, depressed. Others might try to brazen it out. And others, like we saw with the monkeys, might take refuge in things that help alleviate that pain. And now that's what the evidence coming through, again, mostly from the discipline of psychology, is starting to show. So here's depression for US states. Much higher levels of depression in more unequal states, a significant relationship. We also see higher levels of schizophrenia in more unequal countries, psychotic symptoms as well. And a really good paper, again from psychologists in California. My talk is littered with psychologists from California. I need to go out and thank them all sometime. Really good evidence that our dominance behavioral system, which is very ancient in animals and in humans, is related to depression. So we can often withdraw from conflict. And Paul Gilbert at the University of Derby has written a lot about how depression may be a very ancient response to stress and to conflict and to difficult social relationships. You withdraw from that conflict, you withdraw from society. So we're definitely seeing that borne out in the evidence, but also this notion that people might respond by trying to big themselves up. So do any of you ever listen to that radio program from America called That American Life? And it has Garrison Keillor on it doing his Lake Wobegon talks. And Lake Wobegon is a place where all of the children are above average. Okay? Now, whether you like statistics or not, you all know that that is impossible. Unlike our previous education secretary, but never mind. So, in America, 96% of people think they are better drivers than average. Okay? In Sweden, it's only 66% who think they're better drivers than average. It's still too high, okay, but it's a bit more realistic. And in this study, psychologists asked people in these different countries whether or not they were better drivers than average, better looking than average, more intelligent than average, nicer people than average, a whole range of things. And they called this, adding it all up, a measure of self-enhancement, bigging yourself up, making yourself out to be better than you are. And they found that that is related to inequality. So again, another piece of the puzzle that helps us to see the different strategies that we can have as humans to respond to those difficult social relationships and that heightened hierarchy and sense of competition. And borne out as well by the work of Jean Twenge in America, who's been studying narcissism over the decades and has tracked a rise in narcissism among American samples, mostly students over time, and here I'm showing it in relation to their rising levels of income inequality. So people used to think that it was strange that levels of anxiety were rising in America at the same time that self-esteem seemed to be rising, and they couldn't really reconcile the two. And it took a while to figure out that actually sometimes what we think we're measuring when we measure self-esteem isn't realistic self-esteem. It's not a realistic assessment of your own capabilities, it's narcissism. And once you sort of separate those out, then you can see this rising over time. I encourage you all to get online, have a little go at the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. You answer paired questions, you say which statement you agree with most, and at the end you press a button, find out how you're doing. I thought I was doing quite well, and then there was a question that said, do you think the world would be a better place if you were in charge? And I thought, yeah, I do. There's one or two things I would do that would make it a better place right away. And I told Richard, I'm a narcissist. I think the world would be a better place if I was in charge. And he said, you're so wrong. You're not a narcissist. You'd be really worried if you were in charge. And anyway, you've got no idea of the unintended consequences, all those decisions you would make. He's quite right, and obviously less narcissistic than I am. But do have a go. But joking aside, narcissism is, it's terrible for people's friends, family, colleagues, children, everybody around them, and it's not a happy state for people to be in, and this rise, I think, is very worrying. I spoke about there being a sort of a third way of dealing with these issues. Either you go under, or you sort of try and claw up, or perhaps you take refuge in other things. I mentioned drug and alcohol problems, and we've just recently got our hands on some data that allows us to look at the level of problem gambling in different societies, and we're seeing that related to inequality just as we would have expected as well. So there's three different sorts of approaches. I mentioned voting, civic participation earlier. This is a graph, comes from a study from other authors, and I'm sorry I haven't put the source on here. I'll try to remember to send that later. Civic participation includes things like voting, belonging to associations, reading newspapers, all of that sort of thing, and we see much higher levels in the more equal societies. And I think a lot of people starting to write now about how people's sense of participation, their sense of whether or not they are included in society, their voices are heard, underpinning things like Brexit and the current US presidential race. Just with finishing with data, another Californian psychologist, Paul Piff, has done some really interesting studies in the lab and outside on the streets, trying to compare the behavior of people of high status to those of low status. And in one of his studies, they observed drivers at an intersection, and they noted which cars cut off other cars at the intersection, and they wrote down their make and model and year. And then they classified them as expensive cars, luxury cars, or cheap old bangers. And you were much more likely to cut off other people at the intersection if you were in an expensive car. And the same for letting old ladies across the road. So this is at a pedestrian crossing, and you're much less likely to give way and let people cross if you're in an expensive car. And I saw this the other day in Bradford, where I work one day a week. I was at a pedestrian crossing, and the lights were green for people to cross. And just as they started to turn, a bunch of schoolboys came running down the hill, like kids do, and dashed across just as the lights were going to stop them. And the Audi in front of me drove right out and honking his horn, really aggressively. So I took a picture of his number plate. And I'm trying to decide if I've got the nerve to put it on the internet. Paul Piff also did studies in the lab. He would get people in of high and low status. He would put them in an experimental situation where they thought that somebody was distressed to see who was helpful. he would put them in a position where they had a chance to exhibit narcissistic behavior and see what they did. He even saw who was most likely to steal candy from children by putting a big bowl of sweets on the counter and saying, you can have some if you want. They're really for the children in the experiment down the corridor, but take some if you want. And time after time after time in his experiments, those of high status behaved worse. They took the candy from the children, they were narcissistic, they were less empathic, they didn't exhibit pro-social behaviors. But really interestingly, he found that actually if he changed the situation a bit, if he primed them to think about equality, they changed their behavior. And in this experiment, he's looking at a measure of narcissism. And the top line is the difference between people of high social class and low social class without any priming. And the bottom line is when he's got them all to think about whether people should be treated equally. And they just had to write a couple of sentences about why they thought other people should be treated equally. And then they behaved better. And I think of this as a very hopeful piece of evidence, actually, because it suggests that if we learn about the damage done by inequality, if we think about the benefits of treating people equally, we can get people to change their behavior. I think there's a sense among a lot of people that we're very much at a crossroads since the global financial crisis. Some of us might be surprised we're still at that crossroads so long after the global financial crisis, that it would have led to more change more quickly. But there certainly is a sense of people wanting alternative economic paradigms, thinking about new ways of doing capitalism or if it's come to an end, thinking about what course we should be on as a society and as a world. No agreement yet, but certainly lots of new ideas in the air. Earlier, we mentioned the film that's been made, inspired by our book. It was made independently. And I would encourage you to see it if you can, as well as screenings, free screenings in lots of places. It is available on Netflix now. And what the film does is it tells stories, which is very different to what Richard and I do, because we use statistics to tell stories and we show graphs. And lots of people don't like that, surprisingly. Even people in our own families, you know. And lots of people just skip over graphs in books. Their eyes just mist over. Students do it all the time. And you know, the other day someone came to my office because they needed to take a photo of me for some university prospectus, and they said, could you hold a copy of your book? And I hadn't got one. So I said, I'll just go and borrow one from one of my colleagues. Nobody had got one. So you don't always reach the people you want to reach, even if you try to write something that's more popular than a scientific paper, and nobody reads that. But film can tell stories in a different way. And I think for people who find that kind of narrative more compelling, this is a really good thing. It tells the story of 7 different people in the US and the UK and how they experience the levels of inequality in their society. But I'm also really encouraged by this. Many of you will know what this chart is. It's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. They replaced the Millennium Development Goals, which lasted up until 2015. And they're really radically different, even if they're hopeless in all kinds of ways. So the Millennium Development Goals were all about poor countries. Sanitation, maternal mortality, malnutrition. They were all about improving life for people in the developing world. The Sustainable Development Goals, which have replaced them, are for all of us. They're for every country. There are 17 of them, and we're supposed to achieve them all. They include things that are to do with climate action and the environment, which the Millennium Goals didn't do. They still include things like poverty and clean water, because of course that's really important. But they include things that are important to us in the rich, developed world as well, including things like gender equality, and here, goal number 10, reduced inequalities. And these were agreed in end of 2015 by all 193 countries of the United Nations. It's the first time that we have had a global framework like this, with goals, and underneath them sit targets, 169 of them, and underneath those sit indicators, which they haven't finalized yet, but there'll probably be about 300. And every society is supposed to keep track of how they're doing on this and strive to do better. This one is in there despite the opposition of our government. And the high-level panel advising the UN on this was co-chaired by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. And he tried to block inequality being one of the Sustainable Development Goals. But luckily he didn't get his way in that or much else. And we do have reducing inequalities as a goal for us in the UK. So it's up to all of us to make sure that our society strives towards those and not think about sustainable development as being for somebody else. The reason I said they're a bit hopeless is because it's just a dashboard and they all look equally important here. And actually, there are trade-offs. If you do some of these things, you'll make some of the others worse. There's no overarching goal. They're not very coherent. I'm working with a group of people who actually I met when I was doing my work in Bhutan around alternative development paradigms. And we're trying to create models that actually put those sustainable development goals into a coherent framework. This is just one of them. It's not my personal favorite, but it takes the 17 targets, puts them, clusters them by the goals of ecological, economic, sustainable scale, fair distribution, and efficient allocation, and says that will create sustainable well-being for everybody. I'd probably like one that put this right in the middle, and everything else radiating off it. But there's lots of different ways to skin a cat. And one of the things we all need to be doing if we're concerned about development is thinking about how these goals work together and thinking how we can optimize well-being for the world. I'm going to end there so we have some time for questions, if that's okay. I just wanted to put up the Equality Trust website for you. It is a charity now. It's London-based, but there are local groups. There is a Manchester Equality group or a Northwest one. I'm not sure what it's called. But if you're interested in the kinds of things I've been talking about, do visit us at that website. You can download slides, you can read news, you can see summaries of the latest research, and you can find out how to get involved. But I think I'll end by saying that we think that inequality is something that's really tearing our society apart. We're increasingly recognizing that that's so and starting to talk about it. But that's just the first step. And the next step is taking action to unpick it and undo that. And perhaps we'll talk about that a bit in the questions. Thank you all ever so much for listening so patiently.
Thanks so much indeed, Kate. Do you have a roving mic here? Do you have any questions in the centre? And then there. Got you.
Hi, really enjoyed the lecture. Thank you. I have a question. It basically relates to sort of political shifts in the Western world. I think a lot of people on the left sort of hoped that after 2008 there should be or would be a rise up, and there kind of was, but it faded out a bit. And what now seems to be happening is sort of a political shift towards populism and right-wing extremism, and rather than looking at those at the top, we're targeting those at the bottom. So people like refugees, people who need social welfare. So my question is, can we even tackle inequality when we have the discourse of people being deserving and undeserving is so ingrained in our societal thinking?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I'm not a political scientist, so all I can give you is guesses. The evidence does show that you get this polarization in politics and in people's thinking in a more unequal society, and more people feeling excluded, greater likelihood of riots, etc. But you ask, can we, in such an unequal society, sort of fix that? And I suppose I would argue that maybe if we fix the inequality, that might help fix that. And we see sort of populism and the rise of those kinds of sentiments when we have a large swathe of the population feeling excluded. And so thinking about ways to address that seems to me much more important than trying to sort of just deal with the politics of it. I heard the editor, is he the editor? I think he was the editor of the New York Times on the radio in the last couple of days, talking about how he felt the media had some responsibility for the rise and popularity of Donald Trump, because they hadn't realized how angry people felt. They hadn't realized how excluded people felt, and they hadn't addressed that. And he wasn't just talking about the New York Times, he was talking about the American media in general. So I would see inequality as a root cause of many of these issues to do with social unrest, and something that we need to deal with. The way we sometimes talk about dealing with problems, Rich and I, is that it's as if someone's turned on the tap in the bathroom and the bath is overflowing and we keep trying to mop up without turning off the tap. And seeing inequality as that sort of root cause. And we use similar metaphors in public health all the time about whether or not you should, if someone's driving over a cliff, whether you should have a net to catch them halfway or an ambulance to pick them up at the bottom and take them off to hospital, when really what you should be doing is stopping them driving over the cliff in the first place. So I think we view inequality as very much one of those root causes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting. I was wondering if you could elaborate maybe a bit more about the outliers within the different countries. For example, Sweden, I was living there for a year, and it is a very equal country and even reflects in the language. They have the word which is called lagom, which means just right, so not too little, not too much. And at the same time, it's also known that many people have problems with alcoholism, racism, and suicide. I think there was one chart which addressed mental illness, and Sweden was missing from there. So I was wondering, during your research, how okay, if you encountered some of the outliers and how inequality is addressed there relating to psychology and mental health. And also a second question maybe relating to that, do you think, like, since now we more and more talk about urbanization in cities and how contemporary it is to talk about countries when we talk about inequality? Because even within Greater Manchester there are many areas that are better off and less well off.
So your first question first. So I love that Swedish concept of lagom. I know someone who signs all their emails with that, even though they're Australian. So they think it's a concept we ought to embrace. The reason Sweden was not on that particular chart of mental illness is because it didn't have, at the time we were writing, population-based prevalence surveys of mental illness. And at the moment, all that the World Health Organization provides, if you want to compare different countries, is numbers of people treated, availability of beds in mental health hospitals and that kind of thing. The only incidence data that you can actually get for all countries from WHO is suicides. And there, the Scandinavian countries do not do well. And suicide is one of the exceptions to that pattern that I showed you of health and social problems related to inequality. In fact, you get higher rates of suicide where inequality is lower. And suicide often looks like this in comparison to murders, to homicides. So it's as if violence in a society either gets expressed outwards or inwards. And we think that probably is related to psychological differences between societies. You also sort of asked about outliers, and I'm afraid I'm really not that interested in outliers, because on any chart you'll have some outliers, and you can come up with a story of why that particular country does okay on that one. And epidemiologists are particularly good at it. We can always think of a reason why Italy has a low rate of mental illness. It's the common variance that I'm interested in, really. It's inequality as a root cause, rather than why sometimes some countries do a bit better on a particular problem. Second question, cities. So if we look at all of the studies that have been done of income inequality and health, and that's the biggest literature out there on the effects of inequality. If you look at whole societies, whole nations, there's a very consistent effect: more inequality, worse health. If you look at really big areas like US states or very large metropolitan areas, you get the same thing. If you look at little local areas, you don't. And that's because if you live in a poor area, you don't have worse health because of the inequality within it. You have it because you're poor in relation to the rest of society. So measuring inequality at the right scale is important, and it seems to be societal levels of inequality that matter, the social hierarchy in whole societies. But cities are undoubtedly also behave like that. And certainly in large cities like London, Manchester, the biggest cities in the world, Mexico City, Los Angeles, whatever, Tokyo, inequality within those cities will be related to health and well-being in those different cities. And as our world population becomes more urbanized, that becomes really important. And you probably all know that within our cities, we have massive differences in life expectancy or other indicators of health, so that you can go across London and lose a year of life expectancy for every tube stop on the Jubilee line from Westminster and Kensington, I think, over to the docks. And then, in Glasgow, you can get 15-year life expectancy differences, Sheffield, south to north. So those things do matter.
Okay, I've got two questions. Gentleman in purple.
Yeah, thank you. Your index of inequality and social problems appears to only include developed countries and does not seem to include countries experiencing a lot of turmoil, war, social evils, etc. Example, the Middle East, Asia, the African and South American continents. What's the justification for this, and is that not likely to seriously or to be a serious weakness in the efficacy of the data and the strength of your argument?
So there's two reasons why we focus on developed countries in our previous analyses. One is a simple matter of data availability. So some of the things we look at would be available for developing and emerging economies as well, but a lot of them are not. So for instance, the mental illness prevalence data, the social mobility, the trust, and some of those other things. But the most important reason is because we wanted to look at countries where the benefits of economic growth have come to an end, where rising levels of GDP per capita are no longer beneficial for the health and social well-being of the population. So if you look at rich developed countries, there's no relationship at all between their average levels of income and their health. No relationship at all between their average levels of income and their happiness. If you look at the US over time or the UK over time, GDP keeps going up, but health and happiness don't. So we wanted to look at those societies where it appears that the benefits of economic growth have come to an end and see what else is underpinning the health of populations and the well-being of populations. Lots of other academics have looked at income inequality in relation to health and well-being throughout the world. They find the same relationships. In particular, there's been a lot of work on life expectancy and infant mortality rates. For instance, I saw a study not so long ago for Latin American countries that showed lower levels of infant mortality in more equal countries, and showed that economic growth was only beneficial for those populations at times when inequality was lower. There are lots of studies of HIV and AIDS in relation to inequality, and lots of studies in relation to violence in unequal societies. So we see exactly the same patterns in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, but all of those countries crucially need economic growth as well as a reduction in income inequality. Latin America is the only region of the world that's actually becoming noticeably more equal at the moment, and sometimes you can see the benefits of that in population health.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps last question up there. Or
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just struggling to sort of see what you're referring to when you're talking about inequality. Whether it's a specific thing or you're talking about global inequality, and then what would equality look like? Because obviously inequality is such a complex, multifaceted thing, and then, basically, what would the society, world, or whatever look like that was equal?
Right, so the inequality measure that we have used and that we have been interested in is income inequality. It's the differences in incomes within a society, so not between countries, but within a country or within a city or within a state. What's the gap between rich and poor? Is it bigger or is it smaller? Now, obviously, there are lots of other kinds of inequality. There's social class inequality, educational inequality, which sort of measure the same things. Gender inequality, racial inequality, religious inequality. But this measure of income inequality is useful, firstly, because you can get the data. We can't get really good data on wealth inequalities for lots of different countries, but we can for incomes. And also, it seems to be a really good marker of how hierarchical a society is. Now, if I measured what percentage of people in France, say, are in the bottom social class and the top social class, I'd have a measure, but it wouldn't tell me how far apart they were. Just as if I knew that we had, in this country, these days, 50% of people in the middle class, and we used to, a long time ago, have only 30%. I still wouldn't know what social relationships were like, what the distance was between people. So income inequality, although it seems a very singular concept, all the other inequalities seem to hang around it. It seems to represent something that tells us something useful. And some of the, I think there's, as do many other people, is a vertical inequality. So class inequalities and income inequalities and wealth inequalities as being what separates us across the social pyramid. And then all of the other inequalities like gender, disability, race, etc., are more horizontal inequalities. But they all get affected by that vertical inequality as well. So all of those are made worse by the greater vertical inequalities. So inequality, you're right, is a really complex subject, but this simple measure of income inequality seems to be able to tell us something important, seems to be able to help us to learn about how that affects us in our minds, in our bodies, in the way we behave.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.